November 2023. Over Laurel, Mississippi. The air was heavy. Something that would blow up a case the town had been trying to forget for 24 years was discovered by a construction crew digging a new shopping plaza. Forensic teams found evidence that would finally provide an answer to the mystery that had plagued this sleepy southern community since the summer of 1999. Buried beneath 3 feet of red clay soil, covered in a deteriorating blue tarp. Ashley Kemp. What happened to her? On a sweltering July afternoon, the 32-year-old housewife had disappeared from her small ranch home on Magnolia Drive. There was nothing but an empty kitchen with her 2-year-old daughter sobbing in her playpen and a pot of coffee still warm on the counter. No body, no ransom demand, no signs of struggle. While Ashley's family held vigils under the same oak trees that had shaded her childhood, investigators searched for answers for almost 25 years. Her spouse got married again. Her daughter didn't remember her mother's face as she grew up. Though rumors of suspicion persisted, the town moved on. However, the soil beneath Laurel is not very good at keeping secrets, and every presumption this community had about guilt, innocence, and the neighbor who smiled at you across the church pew would be shattered when DNA analysis finally connected the evidence to someone who had lived among them for all these years. Someone they had trusted, and someone they had never suspected. After 24 years of thinking you knew the truth, how do you reconcile it? Prior to moving on with this startling tale, please take a moment to like and subscribe to this video. The algorithm gods will ensure that you don't miss any upcoming uploads, and your support helps uncover these untold tales. November 2023. Over Laurel, Mississippi, the air was thick with the kind of humidity that sticks to skin and makes breathing difficult. When the construction team reached the empty lot on Highway 15 just north of the historic downtown area where Antebellum is located, the sun had just begun to peek through the pine trees. Houses remained as silent reminders of generations of secrets from the South. For many years, the area had been deserted, a forgotten patch of scrub grass and red clay that the locals used as an unofficial route between the First Baptist Church and the Piggly Wiggly. At last, developers bought the land for a new shopping center, another effort to bring life to a town that had been gradually losing its citizens since the timber mill closed in 2003. Jake Morrison had 32 years of experience operating heavy machinery, long enough to understand Mississippi soil's unique resistance when the backhoe bucket hit an object that wasn't supposed to be there. It was an incorrect sound, something muffled and artificial, rather than the scrape of rock or the snap of root caused his hands to pause on the controls. He turned off the engine. He could hear the distant crows in the oak trees and the morning traffic on the highway in the abrupt silence. There was something off about the silence, weighed heavily with the meaning he had not yet identified. "Hey, Curtis," he said. Summoned his foreman. "Come take a look at this." Since before Jake learned to drive, Sis Webb had been overseeing construction sites, and he had witnessed his fair share of surprising finds beneath the southern soil. Native American ceramics and Civil War buttons. Someone once buried a whole Model T Ford instead of having it removed. But when his weathered face turned pale beneath his blue tarp and hard hat, which were deteriorating but still identifiable, when he descended into the shallow excavation and saw what Jake's backhoe had partially exposed, and underneath it, encased in layers, something that had not fared well with time, caused both men to instinctively back off. Curtis said softly, "Call the sheriff. Keep your hands off everything else." And by noon, the empty lot had been turned into a crime scene that would be the talk of the town and the country for months to come. A 50-yard radius was marked off with yellow police tape. While Mississippi Bureau of Investigation forensic technicians labored diligently in the November heat, Jones County Sheriff's deputies stood watch at access points. When Sheriff Dale Pritchard was assigned to regular patrol duty in 1999, he had just graduated from the academy and was a rookie deputy. Every officer who worked on the Ashley Kemp case recalled it as the setback that shaped their early careers, and he did too. Before the case was closed and the file boxes were put in storage, the department's resources had been consumed for months by the missing woman. 24 years now. Later, he watched from the edge of the excavation site as the Mississippi Bureau of Investigation's forensic team took pictures and recorded the items that construction workers had inadvertently discovered. He knew the irony. All those man-hours spent searching through forests, dragging ponds, and following leads that never came to fruition. And for more than 20 years, Ashley Kempt had been here, buried beneath the earth that hundreds of people had crossed. The principal forensic anthropologist, Dr. Sarah Chen, collaborated with the meticulous accuracy of someone who recognized that every little detail counted, and that the purpose of this excavation was not only to recover remains, but also to record evidence that could ultimately provide answers to questions that had plagued a whole community. Because of her experience with cases involving remains that had been buried for a long time, she had been brought in from the state crime lab in Jackson. Her gloved hands cautiously navigated through soil and decomposing matter, stopping occasionally to speak with the forensic photographer who captured every phase of the healing process. Depth of burial is roughly 3 feet. A digital recorder captured her voice. Her voice became evidence, clinically detached in the manner professionals adopt when dealing with tragedy. During the relevant time period, the soil composition, which is consistent with local red clay, is still wrapped in what looks to be a blue polyethylene tarp, which is a common commercial grade that can be purchased at any hardware store. Knowing that he was seeing a cold case turn into an active homicide investigation, Sheriff Pritchard observed from a respectful distance. They finally had something tangible to work with after years of wondering, as Ashley's family held vigils and press conferences and watched her daughter grow up without her mother. It crackled on his radio. "The media is coming, Sheriff. Hattiesburg's Channel 7 just arrived. What should I tell them, in your opinion?" Pritchard let out a sigh. Now the word would get out quickly. The population of a town the size of Laurel is hardly 15,000. Tragedy was remembered by generations, and secrets were money. By nightfall, everyone would be aware that something had been discovered at the Highway 15 construction site. By tomorrow, there would be a lot of conjecture regarding whether Ashley Kempt's remains were present. However, there are some things that cannot be hurried. It would take time to properly identify DNA analysis, forensic examination, and dental records. Despite Pritchard's intuition that they had located her, the burial's location and style matched what, in 1999, investigators theorized that certainty was necessary for evidence. He said into his radio, "Tell them we're looking into a discovery made during construction. Keep them behind the perimeter and don't comment further at this time." Dr. Chen finished the first excavation and recovery by late afternoon. The remains had been carefully taken to the state crime lab in Jackson, where a thorough forensic examination would start, while still covered in their deteriorating tarp shroud right away. However, some information had already surfaced prior to the official identification, making the link to Ashley Kempton's disappearance unavoidable. Fabric fragments consistent with summer clothing had been recovered by forensic technicians. Patterns and cotton fabrics that matched descriptions of Ashley's clothing at the time of her disappearance. More importantly, a gold wedding band with initials and a date engraved on it, as well as a tiny chain, a delicate chain with a silver cross. Both items were detailed in David Kemp's initial July 18, 1999 missing person report. DK and AMA Forever 6-129-3 was inscribed on the wedding band. Ashley's mother had given her the silver cross, which she had worn every day since turning 16. Sheriff Pritchard made the phone call himself, sitting in his office as evening settled over Laurel and casting long shadows through the Venetian blinds. It had been 24 hours since David Kempton's number. Changed years. Throughout the initial investigation, Pritchard had called it numerous times to inform the family of leads that had failed and searches that had turned up nothing. It was a different call. "Dale Pritchard here, David. Come down to the station, please. We discovered something." The other end of the queue was silent for a few seconds. David's voice carried the weight of a man who had spent over half of his life in uncertainty when he finally spoke. "Is it her?" "We'll be certain in a few days," Pritchard stated cautiously. "However, I believe you should call Emily and get ready." The summer of 1999 felt like a time warp in Laurel, Mississippi. Caught between the waning splendor of its lumber boom past and an uncertain future that the majority of its citizens decided not to give much thought to.
The 14,000-person town, which spanned Jones County like a living museum of Southern domesticity, still had Sunday dinner and front porches as gathering places. Holy. Magnolia Drive sliced through the center of what the locals referred to as the good neighborhood. In the thriving 1970s, when the mills were still operating 3 shifts and young families were flocking to Laurel for steady employment and reasonably priced housing, a collection of simple ranch homes and split levels were constructed. The enormous magnolia trees that bordered the street on both sides gave it its name. They provided shade from the scorching Mississippi heat with their glossy leaves and white blooms. Ashley Marie Kemp resided at 247 Magnolia Drive, in a white, shaded pale yellow ranch home with a well-maintained lawn that her husband David mowed every Saturday morning. Although most of her acquaintances said she looked younger, she was 32 years old that summer. She seemed to exude energy even in the most routine interactions, and there was something about the way she smiled. Ashley Marie Chambers was born in the neighboring town of Ellisville. The youngest of 3 daughters, she was raised by parents who were Methodist churchgoers and teachers. Every Sunday, no matter the conditions. In the best possible way, her early years had been uneventful. Girl Scouts, piano lessons, Gulf Coast summer vacations, high school cheerleading, and a hand-sewn prom dress from her mother. In 1989, she had met David Kemp at Jones County Junior College. They both worked day jobs to pay for their tuition while attending evening classes. He wanted to sell insurance and was pursuing a degree in business administration. She intended to teach elementary school after earning her degree in education school. In Introduction to Psychology, they had been assigned to a group project in pairs. Later on, David would make a joke about how he had fallen in love with Pavlov's dogs and Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Almost 200 people attended their small wedding at First Baptist Church in June 1993. This demonstrates the extent to which both families were interwoven with Laurel's community. Older women participated in a potluck dinner during the church fellowship hall reception, competed to determine whose banana pudding would be deemed the best and whose deviled eggs would disappear first.
Ashley never pursued a career in education. She found out she was pregnant 6 months into her first year at Laurel Elementary. It hadn't been hard to decide to become a full-time mother. Ashley had always stated that she wanted to be the type of mother who was there when her kids got home from school and who knew all of their friends, and David's insurance sales company was doing well enough to provide for them comfortably. Emily Rose Kemp, a blonde and blue-eyed baby who appeared to have inherited her mother's upbeat personality from birth, arrived in May 1997. Emily was 2 years old by the summer of 1999, talking in complete sentences and exhibiting the kind of unrestrained curiosity that delighted and tired her parents. Investigators would later learn from Magnolia Drive neighbors that the Kemps seemed to represent the best aspects of small-town Southern life. They maintained their garden, flawless. When you drove by, they waved. They were regulars at First Baptist. David is a deacon. Ashley is instructing the 4-year-olds in Sunday school. Ashley had known Linda Morrison, who lived at 248 Magnolia Drive, right across the street, since the young couple had moved in 6 years prior. They had developed the kind of friendship that allowed them to watch each other's homes while on vacation and borrow cups of sugar without feeling embarrassed. Linda, Ashley was the kind of person who remembered everyone's birthday, would disclose to police during the preliminary inquiry. She made cookies for her new neighbors. Every year, she coordinated the block party for the 4th of July in the neighborhood. Ashley brought dinner to our home 3 nights a week when my mother was ill without being asked. Ashley's personality was reflected in the Kemp house itself. The refrigerator is adorned with family photos and Emily's crayon drawings, and it's cozy without being ostentatious or sterile. The center of the house was the kitchen, where, though David would never dare tell his mother that outright, Ashley spent hours cooking meals that he claimed were superior to anything his mother had ever prepared. In the backyard, she maintained a garden. She didn't do anything fancy. She just put tomatoes, green beans, and flowers in mason jars around the house. Every Wednesday morning, she went to a Bible study with 6 other women from church. They met at different houses each week to talk about the Bible over coffee and homemade coffee cake. Thursday afternoons were for errands. Grocery shopping at the Piggly Wiggly, where she knew all the cashiers by name, picking up David's dry cleaning, stopping at the library, where Emily loved the children's section and the patient librarian who read stories during toddler time. The Kemps usually had dinner at David's parents' house on Friday nights. This was a tradition that started when they got married and continued even after Emily was born. On Sunday mornings, Emily would play in her sandbox while we worked in the yard. Saturday, sometimes in the evenings, they would drive to Hattiesburg for dinner and a movie, leaving Emily with David's mother, who spoiled her granddaughter rotten. Sundays were all about church, going to morning service, having a potluck lunch in the fellowship hall, going to evening service, and then going home to get ready for the next week. It was a routine that was so normal, so predictable, and so normal that when investigators later looked for anything strange or suspicious in Ashley's life, they couldn't find anything. No secret debts, no hidden affairs, no strange phone calls or unexplained absences. Just a young mother living a quiet life on a tree-lined street in a small Mississippi town where everyone knew everyone and nothing bad was supposed to happen. The summer of 1999 came early and stayed late. The temperatures often reached the high 90s, and the humidity made the air feel like warm water. By July, Laurel had already broken several heat records. Local newspapers ran daily stories warning people to stay hydrated and check on their elderly neighbors. Ashley had learned to cope with the heat on her own. Emily spent her mornings being active, going to the neighborhood pool or the little park on Oak Street, where other young mothers congregated to let their kids burn off steam, while the adults complained about the weather and exchanged recipes. The afternoons were spent indoors, where the window air conditioners provided comfort, and Emily napped while Ashley read library paperback novels or caught up on housework. She preferred mystery and romance, nothing too dramatic. Between loads of laundry and Emily's insistence on attention and snacks, she could pick up and put down books. There was enough cooling in the evenings to go back outside. Living in that cozy transitional area between afternoon and night, Ashley and Emily would frequently sit on the front porch in the white wicker chairs that Ashley had painted herself, watching neighbors water lawns and walk dogs and waving to passing cars. David typically got home at 6 o'clock, driving a Ford Taurus into the driveway and coming out of the air-conditioned interior wearing a work suit, slacks, and a button-down shirt with his tie untied.
Ashley watched from the porch, grinning at the routine that was performed 5 days a week with comforting regularity, as Emily ran to meet him and he picked her up. With Emily in her high chair and the television off, dinner was served at the kitchen table at 6:30. She was really too big for it, even at 2 years old. Ashley insisted that they teach her table manners, which included saying please and thank you, sitting correctly, and using utensils rather than fingers. Ashley cleaned the kitchen after supper, while David played with Emily. 7:30 is bath time, 8 is bedtime stories, and 8:30 is lights out. After that, David and Ashley would spend a few hours alone watching TV, discussing their days, and occasionally making love in the practiced silence of parents who knew their child slept in the adjacent room. It was the type of life that led to deep contentment, but dull dinner party tales. During their weekly phone conversation, Ashley told her mother that she couldn't imagine being happier than she was at the moment, in this home, with this family, in this town, where she had grown up and where she intended to spend her later years. The date of that discussion was July 15, 1999. On a hot Sunday afternoon 3 days prior, Ashley Kempton disappeared from her kitchen, leaving a pot of hot coffee behind when David returned home to discover his wife was gone. As if she had been wiped out by the ruthless Mississippi heat that glistened in waves above Magnolia Drive's pavement, and his daughter was crying. July 18, 1999. In Laurel, Mississippi, the Sunday afternoon was hot and still. The heat was so intense that even the cicadas sounded worn out. After the First Baptist Church service ended at noon, there was the traditional potluck lunch in the fellowship hall, where kids ran around and industrial fans pushed warm air in lazy circles. Adults lingered over sweet tea and gossiped between tables. As usual, the Kemp family had been present. As part of his deacon duties, David had served communion while wearing his navy suit in spite of the heat. Ashley had brought her well-known 7-layer salad, which consistently vanished before the fried chicken. The church nursery was where Emily had played. By the time they got into the car for the short drive home, her white Sunday dress was already stained with red punch. By 2 o'clock, they had returned to 247 Magnolia Drive. Because he had looked at the dashboard clock and considered how he had just enough time to change clothes and watch the British Open final round before his parents expected them for Sunday dinner at 5:30, David was able to recall this detail with complete certainty. While David got the empty salad bowl from the back seat, Ashley carried Emily inside. It was a stuffy house. To reduce their electricity bill, they had turned down the air conditioning before church, a small economy that Ashley insisted on despite David's protests that the savings weren't worth coming home to an oven. "I'll get the AC going," Ashley had said, setting Emily down in the living room where her toys were scattered across the carpet. "You want some coffee? I can make a fresh pot." David had nodded, already loosening his tie and heading toward the bedroom to change. He could hear Ashley in the kitchen, the familiar sounds of cabinet doors opening and water running. Emily was talking to her stuffed rabbit, carrying on a one-sided conversation in the earnest way that 2-year-olds do. He'd changed into shorts and a t-shirt, sat on the edge of the bed to remove his dress shoes, and turned on the small television they kept on the dresser. Golf announcers spoke in hushed tones appropriate for the cathedral-like quiet of Championship Sunday. David watched without really seeing, his mind already drifting toward the week ahead. Appointments scheduled, quotes to prepare. The persistent rhythm of selling insurance in a town where everyone knew everyone, and trust mattered more than premium rates. 15 minutes passed, maybe 20. He couldn't be certain later, couldn't reconstruct the exact timeline of those lost moments. Time had a way of blurring when you were comfortable, when nothing seemed urgent. When your wife was in the kitchen making coffee and your daughter was playing happily and the world felt exactly as it should. "Ash," he'd called finally, "coffee ready?" No answer. Just the drone of the television and the hum of the air conditioner now laboring against the afternoon heat. David had walked toward the kitchen, still focused on the golf tournament, expecting to find Ashley pouring coffee or maybe on the phone with her mother. They talked every Sunday afternoon, a ritual as dependable as church itself. The kitchen was empty. The coffee maker sat on the counter, pot half full, the warming plate still blowing red. Steam rose lazily from the dark liquid. Ashley's purse rested on the kitchen table next to the church bulletin and her Bible, with its worn leather cover and ribbon bookmark. Her reading glasses lay folded beside her coffee mug, the one that said, "World's Best Mom," in Emily's handwriting, though of course David had guided her hand to form the letters. "Ashley," David called again, louder this time, an edge of confusion creeping into his voice. He checked the bathroom. Empty. The bedroom they shared? Nothing. Emily's room with its pale pink walls and alphabet border? Vacant except for the stuffed animals arranged on the bed. Back through the living room, where Emily's still playing, oblivious to anything unusual. Down the hallway to the small home office, where Ashley paid bills and kept photo albums organized in chronological order. Nothing. The back door was closed and locked from the inside, the deadbolt engaged, as always. Ashley was meticulous about security, a habit formed by growing up with a father who'd been a police officer before becoming a teacher. David checked anyway, opening the door to peer into the backyard where heat shimmered above the grass and nothing moved except a single crow perched on the fence. The garage? He hurried through the laundry room, fumbling with the door handle. Ashley's white Honda Civic sat exactly where she'd parked it that morning, sunlight streaming through the small window to illuminate the interior, where Emily's car seat was still installed behind the passenger seat. His chest tightened. David returned to the kitchen, staring at the coffee pot as if it might offer explanation. The coffee was still hot when he touched the glass carafe. Recently made, very recently. "Emily," he said, forcing his voice to stay calm as he knelt beside his daughter in the living room. "Where's Mommy?" Emily looked up at him with wide blue eyes, her expression showing no concern. "Emily, bye-bye, bye-bye. Where's sweetheart?" Emily pointed vaguely toward the kitchen, then returned her attention to her rabbit. David Kempton would later tell investigators that he'd spent the next 20 minutes convincing himself there was a logical explanation. Ashley had gone next door to Linda Morrison's house to borrow something. She'd walked down the street to check on someone from church who'd been feeling poorly. She'd stepped outside to water the flowers and gotten distracted talking to a neighbor, but her purse was still on the table. Her car was in the garage. Her shoes, the low heels she'd worn to church, sat by the front door, where she'd slipped them off immediately upon arriving home. As she always did, he'd called her cell phone. It rang in her purse, the cheerful melody muffled by leather and fabric. He checked every room again, opening closets, looking in places that made no sense. The linen closet, under beds, behind the shower curtain, searching for his wife in his own house as if she might be hiding, as if this were some kind of game. By 3:30, David's confusion had crystallized into something colder and sharper. He'd carried Emily across the street to Linda Morrison's house, knocked urgently on the door. "Have you seen Ashley?" he'd asked when Linda answered. Emily balanced on his hip. "Not since church," Linda had replied, her smile fading as she registered the tension in David's face. "Why? What's wrong?" "She's not home. I can't find her anywhere. Her purse is there, her car is there, but she's just gone." Linda had followed him back across the street, searching the house herself as if David might have missed something obvious. They'd called Ashley's parents, her sisters, the few close friends who might know where she'd gone. No one had heard from her since church. At 4:15, David had called the Laurel Police Department from the kitchen phone, his hand shaking as he dialed the non-emergency number. Because surely this wasn't an emergency. Surely there was an explanation. Surely his wife hadn't simply vanished from their locked house on a Sunday afternoon while he watched golf in the next room. "Laurel Police, how can I help you?" "My wife is missing," David had said, the words sounding absurd even as he spoke them. "She was here and now she's gone, and I don't know where she is." Officer Marcus Webb arrived at 2 I-47 Magnolia Drive at 4:43. According to his incident report filed later that evening, he was 36 years old, a 15-year veteran of the Laurel Police Department, experienced enough to know that most missing person calls resolved themselves within hours. The victim had gone shopping and lost track of time, had visited a friend and forgotten to mention it, had taken a walk to clear their head after an argument. But something about David Kemp's voice on the phone had carried an urgency that made Webb respond immediately instead of taking a preliminary report and advising the husband to wait a few hours before worrying. He'd found David pacing the living room while Linda Morrison sat on the couch with Emily, reading her a picture book in a determinedly cheerful voice that didn't quite mask her own growing concern. The house felt wrong to Webb the moment he stepped inside. Too quiet, too still. The air conditioning humming but somehow not dispelling the sense that something fundamental had been disrupted. David led him through the house, pointing out details with the desperate precision of someone who needed a trained observer to confirm that his confusion was justified. The coffee pot still warm, the purse undisturbed, the car in the garage, the shoes by the door. The Bible on the table, open to Psalms, where Ashley had been reading during Sunday school that morning. Webb had taken notes in the small spiral notebook he carried, writing down details that seemed simultaneously significant and meaningless. He'd called for backup, requested a supervisor, and by 5:30, the Kemp house had been transformed from a quiet Sunday afternoon into something else entirely, a crime scene in waiting, though no one wanted to say those words out loud yet. Sergeant James Holloway arrived with 2 additional officers. They'd conducted a systematic search of the house and garage, looking for signs of struggle, forced entry, anything that might explain Ashley Kemp's absence. They found nothing. No broken windows, no damaged locks, no blood, no torn fabric, no overturned furniture. It was as if Ashley had simply ceased to exist somewhere between making coffee and her husband calling her name. By 6 o'clock, as the brutal afternoon heat finally began to ease and long shadows stretched across Magnolia Drive, the Laurel Police Department had initiated a full missing person investigation. Officers were canvassing neighbors, asking if anyone had seen Ashley, if anyone had noticed vehicles that didn't belong, if anyone had heard anything unusual. The responses were uniformly negative. Sunday afternoons were quiet on Magnolia Drive. Most families were at their own houses enjoying air conditioning and preparing for the week ahead. No one had seen Ashley leave her house. No one had noticed any unusual activity. At 7:15, as the sun set in brilliant oranges and purples over Laurel, canine units arrived with bloodhounds trained to track scent. The dogs were given articles of Ashley's clothing from her bedroom, a nightgown, a t-shirt, items that carried her unique scent signature. The bloodhounds had picked up Ashley's trail immediately, following it from the bedroom through the kitchen to the back door. But there, the trail stopped, as if Ashley had simply vanished at the threshold between her house and her backyard. The dogs circled, whined, searched in expanding patterns, but found nothing beyond that point.
It doesn't make sense, the canine handler told Sergeant Holloway as darkness settled completely over the neighborhood. If she left through that door, we'd pick up the trail in the yard, maybe to the fence of the street, but there's nothing. It's like she disappeared right there. David Kempton sat at his kitchen table, still wearing the shorts and t-shirt he'd changed into hours earlier, his face pale and his hands trembling as he answered the same questions over and over. What time did you get home? What was Ashley wearing? Did she seem upset about anything? Had there been any arguments? Any financial problems? Anyone who might want to hurt her? No, nothing was wrong. Everything had been normal, perfect even. They'd been at church, they'd come home, he'd changed clothes, and then she was gone. By midnight, when the initial search of the immediate area had yielded nothing, the investigation had expanded beyond simple protocols for a missing adult. The FBI field office in Jackson had been notified. Ashley's photograph was being distributed to neighboring jurisdictions, and somewhere in the fluorescent-lit offices of the Laurel Police Department, investigators were beginning to acknowledge the possibility that Ashley Kemp hadn't left voluntarily. Someone had taken her, and that someone had done it so smoothly, so completely, that a woman had been removed from her own home in the middle of a Sunday afternoon without leaving a single trace of how it had happened. Dawn broke over Laurel on July 19, 1999, revealing a community transformed overnight by fear and uncertainty. Yellow police tape fluttered across the entrance to Tomb 47 Magnolia Drive, marking the Kemp house as the epicenter of an investigation that would consume the town for months to come. The Laurel Police Department had worked through the night, establishing a command center in the community room at City Hall. By sunrise, more than 40 officers from surrounding jurisdictions had arrived to assist with the search. Volunteers gathered at First Baptist Church, where Pastor Coleman organized teams to comb through woods, drainage ditches, and abandoned properties within a 5-mile radius. Ashley's photograph appeared on the front page of the Laurel Leader Call that morning, the same church directory picture that hung in the hallway of her home. The headline read simply, "Local Mother Missing." The article provided basic details, age, description, last seen at her residence. But between the lines, residents could read the unspoken terror that had settled over their town like morning fog. Statistics became mantras repeated by investigators with grim expertise. The first 24 hours are critical in missing person cases. After 48 hours, the chances of finding someone alive diminish exponentially. Ashley had now been gone for nearly 18 hours, and every minute that passed without answers felt like another door closing on hope. David Kemp had spent the night at the police station answering questions until his voice went hoarse and his eyes grew red from exhaustion and tears. He'd agreed to a polygraph examination without hesitation, understanding that in cases like these, the spouse is always the first suspect. Statistics don't lie. When a woman disappears, the husband is responsible more than 70% of the time. The polygraph results came back clean. David's alibi was airtight. He'd been in the bedroom, watching television, visible from the hallway, while Ashley made coffee in the kitchen.
The timeline was too narrow for him to have done anything to his wife and staged the scene. Unless he was an exceptionally skilled liar with ice water in his veins, David Kemp was a victim, not a perpetrator. But in a small town where everyone knows everyone's business, suspicion doesn't require evidence. It feeds on fear and familiarity, on the uncomfortable truth that most violence comes from people we know and trust. By the end of the first week, the investigation had generated more than 200 tips, each one requiring follow-up, verification, and documentation. A task force had been established with FBI involvement, bringing federal resources and expertise to supplement local law enforcement capabilities. Search teams had covered hundreds of acres of woods and fields surrounding Laurel. Divers had searched every pond and creek within 10 miles. Cadaver dogs had been deployed to abandoned buildings and properties where someone might hide a body. Every effort had yielded nothing but exhaustion and mounting frustration. The red clay soil of Mississippi had been turned and examined. Highway rest stops had been searched. Traffic cameras, the few that existed in 1999, had been reviewed for any sign of Ashley or vehicles that might have been involved in her disappearance. Investigators interviewed everyone who had been at church that Sunday morning. Every neighbor on Magnolia Drive gave statements. Ashley's family, friends, co-workers from her brief teaching career, members of her Bible study group, all were questioned about her state of mind, her relationships, any problems she might have mentioned. The portrait that emerged was maddeningly consistent. Ashley Kemp was happy, stable, devoted to her family, liked by everyone who knew her. No enemies, no secrets, no reason for anyone to harm her, except someone had.
The anonymous letters began arriving in late July, hand-delivered to the police station and the newspaper office, written in careful block letters that revealed nothing about their author. The first one accused Gerald Pritchard, a 53-year-old maintenance worker at Laurel Elementary School, of being involved in Ashley's disappearance. "Check his shed," the letter demanded. "He watches women at the grocery store." Investigators had no choice but to follow up. Pritchard consented to a search of his property. Standing in his driveway with arms crossed, while officers examined his shed, his garage, his attic, they found lawn equipment, paint cans, Christmas decorations. Nothing remotely suspicious, but damage had been done. Neighbors who had known Gerald Pritchard for 20 years began crossing the street to avoid him. Parents complained to the school board about allowing him near children. The accusation had created suspicion where none had existed before, transforming an ordinary man into someone sinister simply because an anonymous letter said he might be guilty. More letters followed. Thomas Bartlett, who lived 4 houses down from the Kemps, was accused of acting strange and being too interested in neighborhood children. James Holloway's brother-in-law, visiting from Alabama at the time of Ashley's disappearance, was fingered as a possible suspect because he drove a pickup truck and looked like a drifter. Each accusation required investigation. Each investigation found nothing. But paranoia had taken root in Laurel, spreading like kudzu through a community that had always prided itself on neighborly trust. Parents who had once let their children play outside unsupervised now kept them within sight at all times. Women who had walked alone to the mailbox or the corner store now moved in pairs. Doors that had rarely been locked, even at night, now featured new deadbolts and chain locks. The social fabric of Magnolia Drive began to fray as neighbors eyed each other with suspicion. Who could be trusted? Who might be hiding something? Everyone became a potential suspect because no one could be definitively ruled out. As summer faded into autumn, the media attention that had descended on Laurel with fierce intensity began to wane. National news outlets moved on to fresher tragedies. Even local coverage diminished to occasional updates that revealed nothing new. Investigation ongoing, no arrests made, families still hoping for Ashley's safe return. But hope was becoming harder to sustain. 3 months without contact suggested something far darker than a voluntary disappearance. The possibility that Ashley was still alive, held somewhere against her will, seemed increasingly remote. Investigators privately acknowledged what they couldn't yet say publicly. They were likely looking for a body now, not a living woman. The Kemp house on Magnolia Drive took on the character of a shrine. Neighbors left flowers on the front porch. Prayer cards appeared tucked into the mailbox. Someone planted a white rose bush by the street with a small wooden cross bearing Ashley's name. David tried to maintain normalcy for Emily's sake, taking her to daycare, feeding her meals, reading bedtime stories with a cheerfulness he didn't feel. But at night, after Emily was asleep, he sat at the kitchen table, staring at the coffee pot that he couldn't bring himself to use, haunted by the last pot of coffee Ashley had made, the warmth that had still radiated from the glass carafe when he discovered her absence. His parents had urged him to move, to leave the house where Ashley had vanished, to make a fresh start somewhere that didn't carry the weight of unanswered questions. But David refused. Moving felt like giving up, like accepting that Ashley was never coming home. On October 18, 1999, 3 months to the day after Ashley's disappearance, First Baptist Church held a prayer vigil in her honor. More than 400 people attended, filling the sanctuary and spilling into the fellowship hall, where the service was broadcast on closed-circuit television. Pastor Coleman spoke about faith in dark times, about trusting God's plan, even when it made no sense to human understanding. Ashley's mother sobbed quietly in the front pew, clutching a framed photograph of her daughter. David sat with Emily on his lap, the toddler confused about why everyone was crying, asking repeatedly where Mommy was. Candles were lit and prayers offered. Hymns were sung with voices that broke on the high notes. And when the service ended and people filed out into the October darkness, carrying their flickering candles against the wind, the only certainty was that Ashley Kempton remained missing, and the investigation had run out of fresh leads to follow. The case file that had filled 2 boxes now occupied an entire shelf in the evidence room. Thousands of pages documenting interviews, searches, tips, dead ends. A comprehensive record of everything investigators had tried and everything that had failed to bring Ashley home. As summer approached and the first anniversary of Ashley's disappearance loomed on the horizon, Laurel settled into an uncomfortable new normal, a town forever changed by the woman who had vanished from her kitchen on a Sunday afternoon, leaving behind only questions that seemed to have no answers. Time has a peculiar cruelty in cold cases. It erodes memory and hope in equal measure, transforming urgent manhunts into footnotes in police archives, turning desperate families into permanent fixtures of grief. For the Kemp family in the town of Laurel, Mississippi, the years after Ashley's disappearance stretched out like a scar that never quite healed. The first anniversary came and went with renewed media coverage and a vigil that felt more like a funeral than a celebration of hope. The second anniversary drew a smaller crowd. By the 5th, only the most dedicated supporters still gathered at First Baptist Church to light candles and pray for answers that seemed increasingly unlikely to come. Emily Kempton grew up with a mother she couldn't remember. The photographs that filled the house, Ashley holding her as an infant, Ashley pushing her on a swing, Ashley smiling at the camera with her daughter on her hip, might as well have been pictures of a stranger. Her memories began at age 3, in the aftermath of trauma, when her parents' parents had moved in to help care for her.
While David struggled to function, David had tried to keep Ashley's memory alive through stories and rituals. Every birthday, he baked the chocolate cake Ashley used to make, following the recipe card written in her neat handwriting. Every Christmas, he hung the ornaments Ashley had collected, explaining the story behind each one. Every Mother's Day, he and Emily visited the memorial garden at First Baptist Church, where a bronze plaque bore Ashley's name and the dates that bracketed her too short life, 1967-1999, though technically she was only presumed dead. In 2003, David had finally removed his wedding ring, not because he'd stopped loving Ashley, but because the weight of it had become unbearable, a constant reminder of vows that couldn't be kept,
promises that had been shattered by circumstances beyond his control. He'd started dating again in 2005, tentatively, guilty, aware that people were watching and judging. How long was long enough to grieve? When did moving forward become betrayal? The women he met were kind but cautious, understanding that they would always be competing with a ghost. In 2008, David married Rebecca Walsh, a widow he'd met at a grief support group in Hattiesburg. She had lost her husband to cancer 3 years earlier and understood complicated mourning. Their wedding was small and quiet, nothing like the celebration David and Ashley had shared at First Baptist. Emily was 11 years old, standing beside her father in a pale blue dress, trying to smile for photographs, while knowing that somewhere in boxes in the attic, there were other wedding photos where a different woman stood in the bride's place. The investigation had never officially closed, but it had slowed to a crawl by 2005. The original detectives had retired or moved to other departments. The boxes of evidence sat in climate-controlled storage, waiting for technology or luck to provide the breakthrough that decades of traditional investigation had failed to produce. In 2010, a tip from an anonymous caller prompted investigators to search a property in rural Jones County, 15 miles south of Laurel. The caller claimed to have information about where Ashley's body had been buried beneath an old barn that had been torn down years earlier. Ground-penetrating radar was deployed. Cadaver dogs swept the area. Forensic teams spent 5 days carefully excavating the site while news helicopters circled overhead and reporters broadcast live updates to a nation that had largely forgotten about Ashley Kemp, but was suddenly reminded that her case remained unsolved. The search yielded nothing. No remains, no evidence, no answers. Just another dead end in a case that seemed to specialize in disappointment. The anonymous caller was never identified. The tip was added to the case file along with hundreds of others that had led nowhere. Psychics claiming to have visions, conspiracy theorists offering elaborate scenarios, well-meaning citizens reporting suspicious neighbors based on nothing more than intuition. Advances in forensic technology brought periodic renewals of hope. In 2012, investigators re-examined all physical evidence collected from the Kemp house using new DNA analysis techniques that hadn't existed in 1999. They found trace evidence, skin cells, hair follicles, fibers, but nothing that could be definitively linked to a perpetrator. The samples were entered into national databases, waiting for a match that might never come. In 2015, the Jones County Sheriff's Department assigned a new detective to review Ashley's case as part of a cold case initiative. Detective Sarah Chen, no relation to the forensic anthropologist who would later work the excavation site in 2023, spent 18 months re-entering witnesses, re-examining evidence, applying fresh eyes to a case that had stagnated for more than 15 years. Her conclusion, documented in a comprehensive report filed in March 2017, was sobering. Without new physical evidence or witness testimony, this case is unlikely to be solved through traditional investigative methods. The perpetrator left minimal forensic evidence, and no witnesses have come forward with actionable information. The case should remain open and active, with periodic reviews as new forensic technologies become available. The report was thorough, professional, and devastating. It confirmed what everyone had suspected, but no one wanted to acknowledge. Ashley Kemp's disappearance might remain a mystery forever. Emily Kemp graduated from Laurel High School in 2015, a quiet teenager who had learned to deflect questions about her famous mother with practiced ease. She'd grown up as that girl whose mother disappeared, an identity she hadn't chosen but couldn't escape. She'd thought about leaving Laurel, going to college somewhere distant where no one knew her story. But in the end, she'd stayed, attending the University of Southern Mississippi in Hattiesburg, close enough to visit her father and stepmother on weekends, far enough to have some independence. She'd studied criminal justice, drawn to the field in ways she didn't fully understand or want to examine too closely. Her professors assumed she wanted to become a police officer. Her friends thought she was interested in forensic psychology. The truth was simpler and more painful. She was trying to understand what happened to the woman in the photographs, the woman who had given her life but remained a stranger. In 2019, Emily graduated with honors and took a job with the Mississippi Center for Missing and Exploited Children, a nonprofit organization that assisted families dealing with the same nightmare her father had endured 20 years earlier. She became the person who answered desperate phone calls at 3 a.m, who helped organize search parties, who sat with families in hospital waiting rooms and police stations, offering the kind of support she wished her family had received 20 years earlier. Her co-workers knew her story. It was impossible to hide in a field where missing persons cases were the daily currency. Some expressed admiration for her strength, her ability to transform personal tragedy into professional purpose. Others worried that she was traumatizing herself,
reliving her mother's disappearance through every case she worked. Emily didn't have answers for them. She only knew that doing this work felt right, felt necessary, felt like the only way to give meaning to a loss that had shaped her entire life without her consent or understanding. By 2020, Ashley Kempton's case had become a local legend, the kind of unsolved mystery that true crime podcasts occasionally featured, and amateur detectives debated in online forums. Theories ranged from plausible to absurd. A serial killer passing through Mississippi, a neighbor with a secret obsession, an elaborate scheme to fake her own death, even alien abduction for those who ventured into the truly bizarre. The 20th anniversary in July 2019 had generated modest media coverage, mostly from regional outlets that interviewed David and Emily about living with unresolved grief. David, now 55 years old and graying at the temples, spoke carefully about hope and acceptance, about learning to live with questions that had no answers. "I don't expect closure anymore," he told a reporter from the Clarion Ledger. "Closure is something people talk about who haven't been through this. What we have is survival. We survive each day, each anniversary, each reminder that Ashley is gone, and we try to honor her memory by living lives she would be proud of." Emily had been less diplomatic. At 23, she still carried anger alongside her grief. "Someone knows what happened to my mother," she'd said, staring directly into the camera. "Someone in this town or someone who used to live here has information they've never shared. And I want them to know that I will never stop looking for answers. Never." The interview had been shared widely on social media, praised for its raw honesty and criticized for its accusatory tone. Emily didn't care. She'd meant every word. The CO-19 pandemic of 2020 brought unexpected changes to cold case investigations across the country. As courts shut down and active cases stalled, some departments redirected resources toward unsolved crimes, using downtime to re-examine old evidence with new techniques. The Jones County Sheriff's Department was among them. In late 2021, investigators sent biological samples from Ashley's case to a private lab specializing in advanced DNA analysis and genetic genealogy, the same techniques that had cracked the Golden State Killer case and dozens of other cold cases that had seemed unsolvable. The process was painstaking and expensive, but it offered something that traditional investigation never could: the ability to identify suspects through family connections in genealogical databases, even if the perpetrators themselves had never been arrested or had their DNA collected. By early 2023, the lab had developed a genetic profile from trace evidence collected at the Kemp House in 1999. The profile was entered into genealogical databases, searching for family matches that might lead investigators to the person who had left their DNA at a crime scene 24 years earlier.
The search generated several potential family trees. Genealogists worked backward from distant cousins to identify possible suspects, eliminating individuals who had died, moved away, or had alibis for July 18, 1999. By October 2023, the list had been narrowed to 3 names. All were men who had lived in or near Laurel in 1999. All were still alive. One name appeared on documents investigators had reviewed decades earlier, a witness interviewed briefly during the initial investigation and never considered seriously as a suspect. His name was Thomas Eugene Bartlett. He lived at 223 Magnolia Drive, 4 houses down from where Ashley Kemp had vanished on a Sunday afternoon, while coffee cooled on her kitchen counter and her daughter played with toys and her husband watched golf in the next room, unaware that in those lost minutes, his entire life was being irrevocably shattered. November 14, 2023, dawn broke cold and clear over Laurel, Mississippi. The kind of autumn morning where breath mists in the air and frost edges the grass in crystalline patterns. At 223 Magnolia Drive, Thomas Eugene Bartlett was drinking coffee in his kitchen when he heard vehicles pulling into his driveway. Not one, but several, their engines idling in the pre-dawn quiet. He was 61 years old now, retired from his job at the lumber supply company where he'd worked for 37 years. His hair had gone completely gray. His hands showed the wear of decades spent loading trucks and operating forklifts. To anyone who knew him, he was Tommy Bartlett, the quiet guy who kept to himself, who volunteered occasionally at First Baptist, who had lived on Magnolia Drive since 1987. He'd watched the Kemps move in across the street in 1993. He'd attended their daughter's baptism at the church. He'd been among the volunteers who searched for Ashley when she disappeared in 1999, walking through woods and calling her name alongside neighbors who never suspected that the person they were looking for might have been taken by someone who lived just 4 houses away. Through the kitchen window, Bartlett could see Sheriff Dale Pritchard approaching his front door, flanked by deputies and FBI agents wearing tactical vests. He sat down his coffee mug with hands that had begun to tremble. 24 years he'd lived. 24 years believing he'd gotten away with it, that the evidence he'd been so careful to eliminate would never be found, that the body he'd buried would remain hidden. But dirt doesn't keep secrets as well as people hope.
And science advances faster than guilt can run. The arrest was executed with methodical precision. Bartlett was read his rights while still standing in his doorway, dressed in sweatpants and a faded mist t-shirt. He didn't resist, didn't protest his innocence, didn't ask what this was about, because he already knew. Thomas Eugene Bartlett, you're under arrest for the murder of Ashley Marie Kempton, Sheriff Pritchard said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his system. This was the arrest he'd waited decades to make, the closure he'd promised Ashley's family when he'd been a rookie deputy with more hope than experience. The news spread through Laurel faster than wildfire. By 9 a.m. that morning, television news trucks had returned to Magnolia Drive, setting up in the same positions they'd occupied in 1999. Reporters who had covered the original disappearance were now covering the arrest, marveling at how a case that had seemed hopelessly cold had suddenly broken wide open. The press conference held at noon was standing room only. Sheriff Pritchard stood behind a podium flanked by FBI representatives and the district attorney, explaining how advanced DNA analysis and genetic genealogy had identified Bartlett as a suspect, how follow-up investigation had confirmed his presence at the Kempt house on July 18, 1999. How the evidence discovered at the construction site had been definitively linked to both Ashley Kemp and Thomas Bartlett. This investigation has been active for 24 years, Pritchard said, his voice carrying the weight of those decades. We never stopped looking for answers. We never stopped believing that justice would eventually be served. Today, because of advances in forensic science and the dedication of investigators who refuse to give up, we can finally say that we know what happened to Ashley Kemp. He paused, looking directly at the cameras, and we can promise her family that the person responsible will be held accountable. The interrogation took place in the same room where David Kempton had been questioned in 1999, answering the same types of questions from investigators who suspected he might have killed his wife. Now it was Bartlett sitting across from detectives, his court-appointed attorney beside him, the fluorescent lights harsh and unforgiving. He'd waived his right to remain silent, surprising his lawyer and the investigators. Perhaps after 24 years of carrying this secret, he was relieved to finally unburden himself. Perhaps he understood that the evidence against him was overwhelming and silence would only delay the inevitable. "I didn't plan it," Bartlett said, his voice flat and emotionless. "I was working in my yard that afternoon. I saw Ashley in her kitchen through the window. She smiled and waved at me the way she always did, and something broke inside me." He'd walked to the Kempton house, he explained, entering through the back door that Ashley had unlocked to let in the afternoon breeze. She'd been surprised to see him, but not alarmed. He was a neighbor, someone she'd known for years, someone she trusted. "I told her I needed to borrow a tool from David's garage," Bartlett continued, his eyes fixed on the table. "She said, 'Sure, go ahead.' But I didn't go to the garage. I came back into the kitchen and I put my hands around her throat." The detectives listened without expression as Bartlett described killing Ashley Kemp while her toddler played in the next room, while her husband watched television down the hall, while coffee cooled on the counter, and Sunday afternoons stretched out peaceful and ordinary beyond the walls of that house. He'd carried her body through the back door, wrapped in a tarp from his own garage, and placed her in his truck. He'd driven to the vacant lot on Highway 15, property his uncle had owned, but never developed, and buried her 3 feet deep in red Mississippi clay. Then he'd returned home, showered, changed clothes, and joined the search party when police arrived hours later, walking through woods and calling Ashley's name alongside David Kemp, offering condolences and support to a man whose wife he'd murdered for reasons he still couldn't fully articulate. "Why?" one of the detectives asked, the only question that seemed to matter. "Why did you do it?" Bartlett shook his head slowly. "I don't know. I've asked myself that question every day for 24 years. I don't have an answer that makes sense. She didn't do anything wrong. I wanted to, and I did." The trial began in August 2024, nearly 25 years after Ashley's death. The Jones County Courthouse was packed with spectators, reporters, and family members who had waited a quarter-century for this moment. David Kemp sat in the front row, Rebecca beside him holding his hand. He was 57 years old now, his hair more gray than brown, his face lined with years of grief that no verdict could erase. But he'd promised Ashley's parents before they died that he would see justice done, and he intended to keep that promise. Emily sat on his other side, 27 years old and no longer the toddler who had cried in her playpen while her mother was murdered in the next room. She had taken leave from her job at the Mississippi Center for Missing and Exploited Children to attend every day of the trial, watching the man who had stolen her mother testify about the crime with the same flat affect he'd shown during his confession. The prosecution's case was overwhelming.
DNA evidence linked Bartlett to the crime scene. Soil samples from his truck matched the composition of earth at the burial site. Phone records showed he'd made calls from the area on the day Ashley disappeared. And his own confession, recorded and played in court, left no room for reasonable doubt. The defense argued that the confession had been coerced, that Bartlett had mental health issues that diminished his culpability, that he deserved mercy because he'd lived a law-abiding life for 2 decades after the murder. The arguments felt hollow, even as they were spoken. Legal motions going through required procedures before reaching an inevitable conclusion. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. Guilty of first-degree murder. Guilty of kidnapping. Guilty of evidence tampering. When the verdict was read, David Kemp closed his eyes and felt tears he'd been holding back for 25 years finally break free.
Emily squeezed his hand so tightly her knuckles went white. And somewhere in the courtroom, someone whispered Ashley, like a prayer, like an acknowledgement, like finally saying goodbye to a woman who had been gone for so long but had never been forgotten. Sentencing came 2 weeks later. Thomas Eugene Bartlett was given life in prison without possibility of parole, the maximum sentence allowed under Mississippi law. He would die behind bars, an old man paying for a crime committed when he was middle-aged, when he'd made a choice that destroyed multiple lives in the span of minutes. Judge Martha Reynolds addressed Bartlett directly before imposing sentence, her voice sharp with controlled anger. "You took a mother from her child, a wife from her husband, a daughter from her parents. You buried her in the ground like she was nothing, and then you lived among the people who mourned her, pretending to be one of them. There is no sentence I can impose that adequately addresses the magnitude of your crime." Bartlett showed no emotion as he was led from the courtroom in shackles. He'd maintained the same flat affect throughout the trial, as if he were watching events happen to someone else, as if 24 years of living with his secret had hollowed him out and left only a shell. Ashley Marie Kemp was finally buried in the Laurel Memorial Cemetery on September 7, 2024. Her parents, who had passed away without ever learning what had become of their daughter, were buried next to her remains. Hundreds of people attended the funeral. Those who had known Ashley, those who had looked for her, those who had followed her case for decades, and those who felt invested in a tale that had finally, belatedly, come to an end. Standing in front of the gathered mourners, Emily gave the eulogy with the strength that reminded she had never really known her mother. Despite the tears streaming down her face, she spoke steadily. "My mother was taken from me when I was too young to remember her. Nevertheless, she influenced my whole life. Her absence has affected everything I have done and every decision I have made. At last, we are able to pay tribute to her not only as a victim, but also as someone who was loved, important, and deserving of much more than what was taken from her." David placed white roses all over the casket, keeping a vow he had made to Ashley at their wedding that he would always love her, never forget her, and make sure their daughter understood how unique her mother had been. The gathered crowd sang Amazing Grace in voices that broke, soared, and finally found harmony as the coffin was lowered into Mississippi soil beneath trees that had seen generations of sorrow and healing. After 25 years of haunting Laurel, the story finally came to an end. However, it was also a chance for a family to find peace, for a community to heal, and for a young girl who had grown up without her mother to realize that justice, no matter how long it took, still mattered. Donations from all over Mississippi and beyond were used to build a memorial in Ashley's honor at First Baptist Church. Her picture, the same image from the church directory that had been on missing person flyers for 20 years, and a brief inscription were displayed on the bronze plaque. Kemp, Ashley Marie, 1967 to 1999. My dear, may her memory serve as a blessing and a reminder that the truth will eventually surface, even if it has been buried for a long time. She was a mother, wife, and daughter. Emily frequently visited the memorial, occasionally bringing flowers and other times just sitting quietly. In her mother's honor, she established a foundation that supported the families of victims of cold cases, funded forensic investigations into unsolved crimes, and promoted the kind of cutting-edge DNA testing that ultimately led to Ashley's murderer's capture. The work ensured that Ashley's story would spare others from similar fates, gave meaning to loss, and turned tragedy into purpose. Eventually, David moved out of the Magnolia Drive home because he could no longer live in the rooms where Ashley only existed as an absence. However, he still occasionally drove by, recalling Sunday afternoons, coffee brewing, and a normal life, until it ended. The collective breath that Laurel, Mississippi had been holding for 25 years was gradually released. The matter was resolved. The murderer was put in jail. Even though it was not perfect, justice had been done. On quiet evenings when the heat shimmers above the pavement and shadows stretch across Magnolia Drive, locals still recalled the woman who disappeared from her kitchen on a Sunday afternoon, as well as the town that refused to forget her until the red clay soil finally gave up its secrets and exposed the truth that had been hidden beneath the surface all along. Don't forget to share this video, hit the notification bell, and subscribe with a person who enjoys true crime narratives. Your assistance raises awareness of cases that might otherwise go unnoticed. Which cold case do you think merits further investigation? Leave a comment below. Every unresolved case symbolizes a family that is still looking for answers and hoping for the resolution that the Martinez family eventually found after nearly 50 years of investigation.